everyone, and welcome to our final Smarter Together webinar series of 2020. When we first started this webinar series back in the summer, we thought this would be a temporary kind of initiative, but it's really kind of morphed into a life of its own in terms of really engaging complex discussions that warrant strong community research partnerships, addressing a lot of the critical issues in terms of how we live, work, and play, and the intersection of technology and innovation in that process. This final webinar topic really is a very good example of that intersection. And here with me on this lovely panel today, we have experts from Georgia Tech, Urban Land Institute, and the Atlanta Regional Commission. So it's going to be a very exciting and very innovative and informative kind of dialogue. I want to just remind the audience that if you are joining us for the first time, feel free to type in your questions on the chat box or on the Q&A. We will get to them at the end when we have more open dialogue, but feel free to type in any questions you have throughout the presentation, and we look forward to listening to you. But up first, let me just introduce our anchor researcher. We always start with a Georgia Tech anchor in terms of what Georgia Tech is doing in terms of this research. And here with me today is Professor Ellen Dunham-Jones. Ellen?
Hello. Glad to be here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share my research, which I am delighted to do. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Deborah. I'm always delighted to be here and share my work. So on the left side of the screen is the cover of a book that my co-author and I wrote 10 years ago on retrofitting suburbia. We were gathering case studies of projects. We had about 80 projects around the U.S. of typical suburban property types that were in one way or another being retrofitted mostly to reduce automobile dependency. So we documented those, and then I've been building a database ever since. I now have over 2,000 examples, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg. Some of the categories I just stopped bothering. There were too many. But they kept getting more and more ambitious, and the retrofits increasingly now, communities who are kind of asking developers, all right, while you reduce automobile dependency, what are you doing for climate change, for equity, for public health, all of these other really urgent challenges? So June and I have decided it was time to write a new book, and we have a brand new book coming out in January. With 32 diverse case studies from across the country in very different kinds of markets. Today, I'm going to share I won't show all of them, I would, much as I love them, but I'm going to share sort of a national case study as well as one that's more local here of examples where dying suburban, shopping malls, office parks, parking lot oriented type sites are being redeveloped, re-inhabited, or re-greened to address really the challenges of the 21st century that these 20th century development patterns were never designed for. So I'm going to run through just some examples that disrupt auto dependence, support an aging population, leverage social capital for equity, add water and energy resilience to be able to adapt to climate change, compete for jobs, and I'll conclude with improving public health, always certainly a big one these days. So job one really is still to disrupt automobile dependence on the car. There's so many cascading kind of negative effects of that, and there's a lot of different really interesting solutions. So walkability, adding transit, adding trails, road diets, all these different things. I'm going to start with an example I'll call the Pike District in Montgomery County, Maryland, about a half-hour drive outside of Washington, D.C., where and I'm going to hide this guy, that happens to be an extremely, a really hot market. Sorry, I'm trying to clean out my screen here. Right. It happens to be a really hot market, and where the county was really interested, but has a lot of characteristics overall. So the county is now retrofitting a 4-mile corridor along the 8-lane Rockville Pike Highway. That you can see the before image here on the upper left. And it looks like a lot of parts of Atlanta. You get low rise, high rise, mid rise, but it's not very walkable, even though it actually does have a transit station. But what they're doing, and they've worked already on the first 400-acre chunk of this, is increasing mobility by adding a street network. So on the upper right here, all of those dashed lines are new streets that are being built on privately owned land, but there will be public streets, and the property owners are being assessed to help pay for them, because they'll be allowed to now build much more densely, and walkable urbanism gives them almost about double the rents. So they're all really quite happy to do so. And what they're also doing, the county has committed to putting Rockville Pike on a road diet, going down from 8 lanes to 6, with bus rapid transit running down the center and dramatically widening the sidewalks. So the first piece that's been built was down below here, lower left. You see the before, a 30-acre strip mall that today is called Pike and Rose, and is a very urban, very dense, very popular, lots of housing, lots of shops at ground level, a new park in there, lots of rooftop farms even, and then the properties over next to the highway will become some pretty high-rise office once the once Rockville Pike gets retrofitted. So this is kind of what's possible, the really significant level of change that is basically transferring trips from the highway to the metro system, and to just allow a lot more trips, to diffuse the car trips, get them off the highway, and now they'll be within a larger street grid, so that those local trips don't have to be on the highway anymore. So really increasing mobility significantly. So at a local level, I wanted to shine a light on what's been happening with downtown Chamblee, which is another case that they have an existing metro station, but the before condition here in 2002, all this gray, these are all just parking lots. And really, downtown Chamblee had a lot of kind of industrial buildings, and a lot of parking lots. And it had its little downtown, but it was not really thriving. Since then, they've now written their zoning code to encourage a lot more construction on those parking lots. They have a lot of new apartments that are coming in. They've increased walkability with a park system and converting a rail line into a new trail that helps reduce the size of their blocks, makes it easier to walk around and bike. They've got some new bike trails. They even have a proposed autonomous shuttle bus in the blue. And it's been very successful. They're now sort of hipsterbia, a lot of young professionals really enjoying moving into those apartments. And they've also adaptively reused a lot of their those old auto body shops are now hip restaurants and things. So it's got a great sense of place. And I want you to keep your eye on this little area in the oval here, where a new project came in that addresses the next challenge, which is support an aging population. So the Atlanta region has been the ARC was really quite a leader in planning for lifelong communities. And there's a lot of strategies that then one wants to, incorporate more missing middle type size housing and accessory dwelling units, ADUs, a lot of attention to There's a lot of seniors are very isolated, so trying to design spaces that really allow them to have more engagement with their neighbors, and also certainly increasing safety. And I think one of the most important is really thinking of integrating senior housing. For too long, we've been planning a lot of our senior communities as sort of isolated, surrounded by some nice landscaping, but very isolated. And it's clearly not what most seniors are increasingly looking for. They want to be a part of their communities. And Chambly has a really terrific example. So in that little oval that I showed, there's been a redevelopment of a former industrial warehouse now has senior housing as well as a Mercy Care small medical care facility. So that you've got the medical institution that is serving a much larger population, but immediately and integrated in with the senior housing. The trail that I pointed out is just right behind the site. And there's a brand new, very walkable Walmart right next to. So the seniors, and they're right near the MARTA station. So this is a really terrific example of integrating seniors into a walkable, transit-oriented development. Another example nationally, I think, of without the transit, but still integrating seniors into the life of their communities is this one out in Wayzata. Promenade at Wayzata in Minnesota was a dead mall that for years was right near next to the main street, but was also had a big parking lot and was just dumping runoff and reducing the quality of the lake, which really was the amenity for this community. It has now been redeveloped and anchored by mostly senior housing. There's also a hotel, some market housing, lots of grocery store, lots of shops, and it centers on a town green that has a lot of activities. And this has been, it's sold out even before construction was completed, extremely popular. It also, the whole thing was, it was a former wetland before the mall came in, so the soil is very porous. They've did an enormous amount of work underground to build in tanks and things so that there's zero stormwater runoff. And as a result, while they're doing that, they were able to install a pretty extensive geothermal energy system, which then allows that all of the sidewalks are heated throughout the winter so that seniors can be more safely walk around, and everybody else can walk around more safely. The next big challenge is building equity, and in particular, really using social infrastructure. Social infrastructure can be everything from education, childcare, affordable transportation. And we see a lot of that by just re-inhabiting existing old strip malls or big box stores with more community serving uses as a form of social infrastructure. We also see social infrastructure is often those outdoor great gathering spaces. So often just regreening some of these properties to create small programmed parks becomes very important for helping build community. And then expanding affordability in the redeveloped areas, there's a whole host of strategies for that as well, as shown on this slide. So I'm just going to show two examples. Again, one that I love here in Atlanta is Margie Stagmeyer, who has both a for-profit and a not-for-profit that targets purchasing aging, older garden apartment complexes located in the worst performing elementary school districts. And she makes one change. She takes one unit and re-inhabits it with an after-school program, usually in partnership with that elementary school. And the impact, the ripple effects are just absolutely astonishing. A lot of these, Atlanta has been one of the leaders in the suburbanization of poverty. A lot of the people living in a lot of these aging garden apartment complexes become extremely transient. This is sort of housing of last resort. They're often not, if it's a lot of single moms, and having the after school program suddenly stabilizes. Those kids are able to really get a better education. The moms are less likely to lose their job because if they miss a shift at the kid's 6, because now everybody kind of can cover for each other. It's really been a phenomenal retrofit. And then the schools then have gone from being often the worst performing to becoming sometimes the best improved schools. So just a minor little retrofit just has phenomenal impacts. And Margie now preaches, don't raise the rents in these places because you want that stable you want a stable population who are able to really, so that the kids are really not constantly moving from school to school. And it just, she ends up then having full, no vacancies, and she ends up making more money at the same time. So it's a win-win and a great model. But also that need for public just gathering spaces, places for a community to bond, at the larger scale are also extremely important. So in Sandy Springs, a former Target strip mall has been turned into really the town center, a civic center with a performing arts space, number of shops and restaurants and housing. And in particular, all sort of wrapping around this big green that is programmed with a lot of those social events. The role of these greens is not so much that people do need to see green, but in the suburbs, there's usually plenty of leafy environments around. It's that ability to gather and really feel part of a community that is so incredibly important. Climate change is obviously another enormous challenge. I'm only going to talk about water resilience, but energy resilience is also an important part. Lots of strategies on water quality, too little, too much. There's a lot we need to be doing here. And Atlanta is quite a leader in building stormwater parks. These are parks that are designed a little bit like a bathtub to be able to, when things are dry, they're a beautiful park and used just as the way all parks can be used. But during storms, a stormwater park can hold all and retain all of the stormwater, in this case for about a 300-acre subbasin. And that helps dramatically reduces flooding. It also, in our case, it reduces the combined sewer overflow problem that is pretty massive. So in the historic Fourth Ward Park, retrofitted 17 acres of parking lots into a stormwater park. And it's really, there are weddings held at this facility, even though really it's a sewer project. That has but it's become an amenity now that has attracted an enormous amount of redevelopment around it. It's right on the Beltline. It's right next to Ponce City Market. The combination has also resulted in gentrification and displacement of many of the folks that this facility was really designed to serve. So we have a lot more we need to be doing with anti-displacement, when we put in amenities, but we also still need a lot more stormwater parks. And there are very few retrofits that really get into residential neighborhoods, but this is a really great one. In Maplewood, Minnesota, every time there's a need to, that kind of regular repaving of streets, they use it as an opportunity to narrow the streets. That has a number of impacts. That slows traffic, reduces urban heat island effects. But while they narrow the street, They then also put in sidewalks. That's helping to increase public health, people getting out, walking around more, reducing their need to get in the car as much. And then they put in street trees if they aren't already there, and they invite the homeowners to put in rain gardens. The rain gardens absorb and infiltrate so much of the stormwater that now only 10% of the runoff that used to go into the creeks and was polluting the land of lakes is it's dramatically helping to improve water quality throughout the region. And the rain gardens are really quite beautiful and create a wonderful amenity as well. Now, I also it's important, the suburbs didn't used to have to really compete for jobs. It was seen, cities were seen as kind of deteriorating, and people wanted to have opportunities to work in the suburbs. That's been shifting. It may be shifting back again. But there's an awful lot of opportunity, of need, really increasingly in the suburbs, to recognize how to compete for jobs. Increasingly, urbanism is really the new amenity, and office parks are kind of aging. One of those aging office parks was out in Peachtree Corners, a huge office park, 500 acres, and tenants said they were having a hard time attracting employees. They couldn't compete with downtown or midtown. So the city now recently incorporated, and as a new city, they attracted the first housing. They enabled housing to come into the office park and recruited and built what they were referring to as millennial housing to really try to attract the younger employees. And then they also built a trail system because they said, oh, look, the millennials, they like to bike to work. And it's really worked. It's been it's quite an attractive amenity. I mean, you're not going to urbanize these low density, hilly places with whole new street networks, but you can get in trails. They've also built a autonomous vehicle test track, and both have really, their employees, they're having a much easier time attracting employees now. Quite a successful project. Small business is also incredibly important to be able to attract in the suburbs. And I love this example. Plaza Fiesta is a mall out on Buford Highway. It was originally the Buford Claremont Mall. Then when there were a number of Asian immigrants, it was rethemed as Oriental Garden. It is, for the last decade, it's been Plaza Fiesta. And one of the main, in response to enormous increase in Hispanic immigrants, and one of the changes that the owners made was they converted one of their anchor stores into a mercado. So over here on the left slide, you can see now it's 140 little 10 by 10 foot stalls, much more like you might find in a Mexican market. This has allowed 140 mostly immigrant entrepreneurs to start small businesses. And at the same time, the mall owner says he's getting about double the rent that he would get from a single owner. And it's really become a community center, a true community hub with a lot of Spanish-speaking services, shops, and they bring in entertainment and often political rallies. So lastly, I want to talk about improving public health. Obviously, the pandemic has everybody very worried about infectious diseases, but it's important not to forget that chronic diseases actually kill more people, and there's no vaccine for sprawl. So chronic diseases are generally, in the US, the most epidemic is obesity, which leads to diabetes, heart disease, the other really big killers. And increasingly, we're seeing loneliness is considered an epidemic in the US. These are things that really we can do a better job of designing our cities for. And sadly, it's the people with chronic diseases that are then even more likely to die from COVID. So we really can't, most of the public health things that we need to be looking out for long term are more about just, trying to increase physical activity, reduce the number one health issue really is from income inequality. But so long list here of things that that we can and should be doing to improve public health. So I'm just showing one example, because this one you start to see how you begin to layer a lot of different, a simple solution can begin to actually treat a lot of these different issues. So this is Lancaster, California, about 2 hours outside of Los Angeles. Their main street in 2009, upper left here, was 5 lanes. The shops, a lot of vacancies, and some kind of antique stores. But most of the businesses had long since moved to the mall in the next town over. They had tried widening the street to make it easier to get to their main street. That just meant people were zipping through it. They then did the opposite, and they went from 5 lanes to 2 and put the parking in the middle, in between street trees and street lights. And they used light-colored permeable paving. They've dramatically reduced urban heat island, and this is out in the desert. They've dramatically reduced car crashes. So they've increased safety in those 2 realms, but they've introduced more biophilia that increases mental health, and they've created a place. Suddenly, downtown is now thriving. I went out and talked with shop owners who said, "Oh, the mall keeps calling me. They want me to come back." No, I'd much rather be here. And most of the time, that central space is just used as parking, but they can also have a weekly farmers market. They have various festivals. It just becomes this really kind of fabulous place, now known as the Boulevard, the BLVD, the Boulevard. So my last slide is this infographic that we created for the new book. And really, it's, to kind of say, it's important to layer as many of these solutions to as many challenges as possible. But if you only do one thing, put in sidewalks. The point of this drawing is to say 75% of residential land in American cities is zoned exclusively for single-family detached dwellings. Yet, if retrofitted with sidewalks and bike lanes, nearly half of the trips that they generate would not need to be made by car. And that would dramatically improve our public health, our environmental health, our economic health, and all of these things. So nearly half of trips are 3 miles or less that generated in suburban areas. So there really are some pretty great opportunities here. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and get the little stop sharing screen logo to come up. Okay, end of slideshow, click to exit. I've lost the stop sharing. All right, there we go.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Ellen. I always appreciate your presentations because there's always a strong visual element to you explaining that change and no more the change happening on the ground in terms of the shift in suburban landscape. So really appreciate it. I'm also looking forward to going on a deeper dive on your second book, which I know you worked really hard on with June over the holidays. So this will be great. Obviously, your book will be a great holiday gift for anyone who's interested out there in the audience. But just to kick off with, there were a couple questions online that I'm listening to, but just so the audience knows, this webinar is recorded and we'll also have Ellen's slides available to share afterwards. So very much part of the learning experience. So if you miss any part of this or have to leave early, feel free to circle back on the slides and the recording. But first thing, Ellen, just to kick off, I mean, you mentioned sidewalks being a very easy thing to do in terms of the initial thing to kind of change the landscape against obviously the demographic changes and the shift in priorities against climate change and health. But for a lot of communities and community leaders that are in the audience right now today, we saw a lot of the before and after. You know, this is what it looked like before, and then here's the wonderful things that transform from that. You know, for the communities that are just beginning to start this process, what are the smaller things that can allow them to think about this in terms of that process and that evolution of change before you get to the beautiful picture, if you will? What can they do first? What are some smaller things? Obviously sidewalks, but what else?
So actually, one of my favorite is simply, you know, if the market isn't demanding urbanism yet, but you're trying to get there, so any project that you're permitting today that is going to have a parking lot, just ask that that parking lot be designed as a future building site. And it might be as simple as just simply say, okay, look, do the sewer hookup. Don't just do it diagonally underground and diagonally across the parking lot. Put the sewer hookup through the drive lane. And it's remarkable how that's actually a really pretty easy ask, so that at least you're setting up for future retrofits when the market hasn't quite caught up yet. But if to also it doesn't cost as much money to just really work on your zoning and planning. So planning, identifying what are those properties that are vulnerable to change, and rezoning them, and with consulting with your community. What kind of change do you hope to see? We're gonna, I think, see a lot more dead retail. It's just kind of the reality. So now's a good time.
Well, let me add Sam into the conversation, and Sarah as well. Sam, to put a macro level connection to this, you lead community development at the Atlanta Regional Commission. ARC has been a clear leader in trying to assess the level of change that's happening in the region, the demographic shifts, the stats, the data that ARC has come out in terms of what is going to happen in the region in the next 10 to 20 years. How do you account for that kind of regional change against what Ellen's proposed in terms of the shifts against suburban, urban landscape, if you will?
So as I was listening to, so I'll start with just one quick anecdote though, to respond to Ellen's comment about sidewalks. I live in an LCI community technically, and we have beautiful sidewalks here. We have, a park in front of the house, but right outside of the LCI area where we have the grocery store and some of the amenities that we would access, there's no sidewalks. So we live in a neighborhood where we end up often getting in our car to go across the street to do our grocery run. So that just reminded me of, like, if we could just build some of those sidewalk connections, it could tremendously cut all those trips that we're making in this small neighborhood of ours. So I just wanted to share that with you all.
And for the audience, LCI's Livable Communities Initiative is one of ARC's flagship community grant programs to really support community transportation and regional development.
So to that end, what I did want to share was about the idea of, like, ARC has been working with communities over the last few decades in helping reimagine several of our regions, like underutilized, underperforming, and underappreciated commercial areas, right? And so for folks that are not aware, back in 2000, we ran an analysis that found that among the 66 urban areas with populations over 50,000, ARC ranked fourth in terms of land area, but 56th in terms of population density. So that gives you a little bit of macro level sort of understanding of the lay of the land, literally. it's no surprise that we're held up nationally as an example of suburban sprawl and its impacts, right? So because of this, again, we're also ranked fourth nationally in terms of the vehicle miles traveled. So that, again, sort of relates back to air quality. And that is one of our major mandates, right? This is a major contributor to our region not meeting federally designated air quality standards. So back in the 90s, the concept that we're talking about today, all the wonderful things we're talking about, mixed use, density, central green spaces, that were relatively new. We were still not very comfortable with these concepts, or a lot of our region's communities were still considering this and trying to understand the benefits of them. Dense developments were not very popular at that point. But again, since then, though, since we put this Livable Centers Initiative program in place, our region has changed significantly. It has led to us being able to fund upwards of 120 planning studies, similar to what Ellen was saying, working with communities to plan for the change. We have dedicated, again, a lot of funding to it, and also on the back end, spent upwards of $250 million in doing improvements that support this type of investment, right? I think Ellen pointed to Chamblee as an example. Again, it's added more than 1,000 new residential units. That's in an area which had 0 back in 2000. So, and then again, you see all those redevelopment examples. McDonough Street being another indicator where we have sort of seen this big transformation of streets that can accommodate green infrastructure into sort of like a cycle track amenity. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there has been tremendous progress in our region when it comes to adopting and implementing the concept of retrofitting suburbia. Unfortunately, we do have given the fact that our origins were in sort of this sprawled development pattern. But the demographic shifts that we're seeing, as the region, we're going to add upwards of 3 million or close to 3 million people by 2050. We are also going to see both a increase in the older population, right? We're going to see folks that are, right now it's about 4% of our older adults in the region are 75 and above. By 2050, it's going to be 12%. And again, if you look at the fact that most of those folks, you typically will outlive your ability to drive. And so if you're trying to talk about how you're creating these communities for folks that are not, that work for them, you have to sort of look beyond the auto dependence. And it's the same for when you look at, that does not necessarily mean that we're just aging. We're also going to have a strong growth in our working age population. Frankly, it's going to be higher than what we're going to see in the Midwest and in the Northeast. So at the same time, we're going to see these demographic shifts where there is a need and a desire to create these places that provide more of an experience, where the jobs are closer to the places they live. And so I think that's generally the direction that we're trending in as a region. I don't know if that gets to your question, though.
No, it's definitely the start. And let me pull Sarah in too. Sarah, you lead the Urban Land Institute for Atlanta and have been just a phenomenal leader in the housing and affordable housing space locally here. Can you shed some light in obviously the local housing against the backdrop of what Ellen said in her presentation, which is the single family housing stock, of course, is not as sustainable given the trends that we see against the demographics and again the shift in priorities against climate change and health, and how does that juxtapose with the local housing condition and of course the targets that we have for affordable housing?
Well, thanks, Deborah, and I'll echo your enthusiasm for hearing Ellen's presentations. I always enjoy and learn a lot, and I'm just grateful that, Ellen, you're here in Atlanta and helping to lead this work. If there is a mantra of this year related to real estate and land use, it is certainly acceleration. And as I listened to Ellen speak, and I was kind of taking notes, I went, yep, that's accelerating, and that's accelerating, and that's accelerating. I know this wasn't your question, but just take retail, right? Prior to the this current downturn and COVID crisis, we were seeing more retail closures than we typically see in a recession, right? That was pre-COVID. So COVID has accelerated that to perhaps an alarming degree. I was known to say pre-pandemic that we had an affordable housing crisis. People would give me a little flack that, Sarah, is it really a crisis? Are you being, exaggerating or engaging in hyperbole? And I did think at the time it was a crisis. I think that COVID has really underscored how deep it is and how broad it is in terms of it is not a city problem. It's not an inner ring suburb problem. It is a regional crisis. And, one of the things people talked about is the notion, you kind of heard early on of what the economic impact was going to be, and everyone had their favorite letter, right? Was it a V-shaped recovery where we went down fast and back up? Was it W? And we were going to, do this, and we could go through the alphabet. L was sort of the doomsday. But as some of you probably heard before, most people are referring to this right now as a K-shaped recovery, meaning those who were pretty well off are going back up, and those who are struggling are moving down. And housing stability is so foundational to folks' ability to thrive. That, the need to invest in stabilizing our current housing stock, preserving the affordable housing that we do have is a major need. If I were in charge of leading a community, I would be scouring my landscape for where there are opportunities to do what Ellen described with Margie Stagmeyer's work of preserving that asset of affordability, and because of all the things it does related to health, related to educational outcomes, and so forth. The land use piece is, single family housing absorbs, if you will, more of our housing stock than anything in the country, right? So if we're looking to change issues related to climate and mobility and all of those, that's a huge piece of it. And so I think it was back in 2017, we published a report called Housing in the Evolving American Suburb, and we did a deep dive on Atlanta. And then I really credit ARC for lifting up some of that, as well as work that we've done on setting goals around affordability to say, the suburbs aren't monolithic, right? We've got lots of different types of markets. We've got high-end suburbs. We've got economically distressed suburbs. We have suburbs that have more rural character. And then we have this rare breed that's less than we can find every day, which is sort of stable middle income suburbs. And that's related to that K-shaped recovery. But prior to the time that we're in, we were all talking about we need greater affordability and greater diversity of product types in the suburbs to serve that aging population. I was noting in the next 10 years, the retiree population in the U.S. is expected to grow by 17.1 million, right? I mean, and as Sam was sharing, it's a relatively small cohort in Atlanta that's expected to grow a lot. And so when you're thinking about a base being pretty small with high growth, what that means for the diversity of housing types we need throughout our region is a really big deal. And so I think it just presents enormous opportunity to be more flexible, to think about the zoning, to think about form-based type approaches to allow flexibility over time to be more responsive to those needs and to address those issues of equity in suburban communities.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm glad you obviously brought up the pandemic. I was trying to avoid that until like a third round of questions maybe, but obviously it's a very important part. And to this webinar, it goes beyond health and economic development. It really affects the way that our physical infrastructure is designed and placed, and obviously our interaction with it. But Ellen, back to you. You started this research before the pandemic, and obviously you wrote your first book a decade or so before the pandemic. So can you tell us a little bit about how the pandemic has affected your research findings in terms of the retrofit in suburbia, and what that has meant in terms of whether it has an impact or accelerated or decelerated, where we see the trends that Sarah was talking about even before the pandemic?
I think what I'm seeing is very much like what Sarah said. It's just acceleration. I know I've talked with a couple of pretty large developers. They're going on shopping sprees for the dead mall sites in strong markets where they want to do a lot of mixed use redevelopment. And I think what's really different about this new wave of folks who are driving up the purchase of single family homes around the country is that for the first time, most of the people who are buying these homes are actually people who liked an urban lifestyle, but just once it came time to suddenly I've got 2 people working from home and a bunch of kids working from home, an apartment doesn't cut it anymore. And they really just need space. But these were people who before the pandemic, they had chosen a more urban lifestyle. We see the same thing in Atlanta with a lot of single adults moving out of high-priced apartments that are right along the Beltline or, and close to a lot of nightlife and bars that now are unsafe. And so they're moving out to more suburban apartments that are a lot cheaper. But if those suburban communities want to retain those new households in the long run, they're going to start retrofitting. They're going to have to start providing some of those more lifestyles that allow you to live in a more suburban location, but still have a more urban lifestyle. That means some nightlife, some walking, a lot more mixed uses, a lot more shared environments. I think the property types that are just flying off the markets, missing middle kinds of houses, cottage courts, where, the kids don't play in one backyard, the kids can play together in a shared courtyard, or where the elderly seniors who are downsizing can downsize into a cottage, but they're now still part of a network. It's not as, so we're seeing a shift from the suburbs were always emphasizing privacy. And I think what we're seeing as a result of the pandemic is people craving that feeling of belonging to a community. And so the housing types that kind of cluster, and instead of just large lot, single house, I think we're going to see multiple trends kind of playing out simultaneously, but that's certainly the big new one. So I see this as just, again, like I'll use that now. Sarah said, accelerating.
We're getting a number of questions from our audience, so I'm going to try to consolidate some of these questions and hit them as much as possible. But there are a few questions around gentrification. And obviously, the general question I think that's coming is, how do you avoid gentrification when it comes to retrofitting? How can you maintain that sense of local identity and that uniqueness when you're doing these larger retrofit plans?
So I think two things. One, it's really important to distinguish between gentrification and displacement. There are lots of very underserved, underinvested in communities that actually need some degree of improvements being made to them and would benefit from some more diverse population. But they don't want, it's the displacement that's the problem. And then the second thing I think that it's important to distinguish is that retrofitting really, June and I try to emphasize this. It is not only about redevelopment. Redevelopment is one of the really important strategies, and it's what most communities want because it increases the tax base. But reinhabitation with more community-serving uses is an absolutely really vital part of retrofitting as well. And it has tends to result in much more what is sometimes referred to as gentrification. You're not getting all of the environmental benefits. You're not necessarily increasing walkability. But if you are turning a former space that was only about retail into now incubator business, small business entrepreneurs, and there's loads of examples of that, or bringing in healthcare, bringing in education. Those are ways of improving access to opportunities of existing local populations and actually relocalizing the identity of that community. Instead of just chain stores, now you've got your school, your community college, your and a lot of churches go in. A lot of it's a lot more social infrastructure. So it's really not gentrification. And then where I get most worried about, I am worried about gentrification clearly, but where I'm most worried about it are with the aging garden apartment complexes. We have way too many examples of where a community, a lot of them are unhealthy, moldy, aging places. They're aging out. And so communities are happy when a developer comes in and says, look, I'd like to triple the density on this site, allow me to do that. But at the same time, you're tripling the rents,
right.
Generally when that happens. And that's the category where we're failing right now.
Sarah?
If I could challenge folks, if you could look at those garden-style aging apartments as a rare gem in your community. I know that's hard for people to do, but the cost to replace that affordability is enormous fiscally, from a density perspective, the land. And so if you could invert your whole thinking on those garden-style aging apartments and say that is a precious resource we must invest in and preserve, particularly when you think about folks' fiscal constraints, right? Like no one's coming out of this with more resources than they had before. So that's one thing I would say, if we could radically change our thinking about it, it would be to everyone's benefit. And I'll just make two other quick points. There are a whole lot of policies that address the physical displacement, whether it be inclusionary zoning policies that are set when any new infrastructure goes in, not after. That's when you get all the problems. Before you're putting in that new walking, biking, park, et cetera, you've got to include the policy baked into the deal. There are things with taxes for existing owners, buying your own building for businesses. But the other thing I'd underscore is something I've learned in the last couple of years is I think when people talk about gentrification, they're often talking about developments being done to me and not with me. And that sounds a little loosey-goosey, but the opportunity to really work with community and help them have an opportunity to shape the outcome makes a huge difference, right? Because if it's for you and with you, it changes your whole perception of what it is because you believe that you'll be there to benefit in the end. So, there are a lot of programs that can work with that, but I think that's something that's sometimes missed when we talk about gentrification.
And one thing I'll piggyback off Sarah's previous comment about, if you start looking at these garden apartments as gems, it is critical we do that because we know that if you look at the trend of new construction, we're not building nearly anywhere close to what we need to be building. And the cost of construction is going high. So if there is a hope, if we're looking at solutions or a set of solutions, we need to be emphasizing the preservation of the existing supply of homes as much as affordable homes, as much as we're focusing on constructing new affordable homes, which you can almost argue is easier or more beneficial to preserve. The one thing I will say from our perspective, when we started looking at the LCI program, the Livable Centers Initiative, a few years ago, again, we tout about the success of the program and how great it has done in terms of redevelopment. The one thing we grew more and more conscious of the fact was when we say livable center, livable for who? And so we increasingly noticed that the rents, the home prices or the condo prices, whatever they were catering to a very small market in the community or folks outside of the community. So we have focused in on moving forward as we're doing these programs with communities to emphasize the need to address housing affordability as a critical element of creating a livable center. So in order for you to work on creating a plan of a downtown center, you need to be thinking about proactively at the front end with the community, like Sarah said, about what are you going to do to address the folks that are in your community that are looking for housing and the rents and the home prices that they can afford. What are they able to afford in this area? And so that's been a pivot in the way we're approaching it. We're challenging the folks we're working with to approach it, which is just one small way, but I think is a critical way to look at this work.
There are so many more questions from our audience, and we are actually less than a minute before closing. I feel like we've just started this conversation, and I feel like we can actually continue so much more. But before I close, let me just ask one more lightning round of questions. We talked about sidewalks being an immediate infrastructure change that could be done. Any fast policy issues? Because from our audience, I'm seeing that recommendations on changing housing code to multifamily, affecting social housing in terms of co-housing and shared equity among community land trusts. Just quick panel round of just any policies that you see that could be helping to address retrofit in suburbia. And I'll start with you, Sam.
I mean, look at your zoning code. If you change your parking requirements and your minimum lot requirements, that can go a long way for you in terms of policies to address the housing issues or even commercial issues in your community.
Right, Ellen?
What I hear from designers on specifically on the affordable housing, what I hear over and over is that it's extremely difficult. The regulations that we have in place, and in general, I mean, the regulations are there for a good reason, but the regulations that require every unit to have handicap bathroom, that require really quite large units, a lot of the housing that meets affordable housing standards is actually larger than what we're seeing. Market rate housing is getting smaller and smaller, and yet the affordable housing is required to actually be that much more generous. So I think we're in need of some regulatory shifts and just more flexibility to allow people to get a lot more creative. Affordable housing could be going in as in adaptive reuse, but it never will meet the requirements coming out of the low-income housing tax credits when it does that. It just gets so complicated.
And Sarah, you have the last word.
I'll take it in a slightly different direction. Every community can look at its publicly owned land and other public assets. It's someone called it the untapped wealth of cities, right? We've got these right-of-ways, we've got excess school properties, we've got all sorts of things that we can think about for community resources, for all the things Ellen's talked about, but make sure they walk and chew gum at the same time. No asset should do one thing, right? It should check a lot of these boxes. And so institute those types of policies, that how you can use your public assets And along those lines, think about things like, schools as community green space, right? Like we have so much private assets, even within the public sector. No, that belongs to the school. That's not for the community. Think about how you can change policies like that to open up resources for more than one group.
Thank you, Ellen, Sam, Sarah, on a very lively and important conversation on Retrofitting Suburbia. Thank you to our virtual audience out there. This is the last webinar of 2020, but feel free to stay and listen to our other webinars in the past months, and we'll see you next year. Thank you.